So happy Friday, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joe Schlesinger, today on behalf of our HFES student chapter. He may just be the jazziest colloquium speaker we've hosted. And also, fun fact, went to high school in this great state of Friday night fish fry and Culver's frozen custard. So we're sorry, Joe, that this can't be an in-person colloquium so you can enjoy those Wisconsin things. Dr. Schlesinger is an associate professor in the Department of Anesthesiology and Division of Critical Care Medicine at Vanderbilt University, and is an adjunct professor of electrical and computer engineering at McGill University in Montreal. He has a bachelor's of arts in music with a concentration in jazz piano performance from Loyola University. And he earned his medical degree from the University of Texas at Houston. So he was just telling us about how he's got a couple different accents that come out every once in a while. And he completed residency training in anesthesiology and then a fellowship in critical care medicine at Vanderbilt. His research interests include multisensory integration, human factors, oral perception, temporal precision, alarm development, patient monitoring, and medical education, and has many prestigious awards. But I think most importantly, besides his impressive academic accolades, he's been featured on my favorite podcast, 99% Invisible, and some other well-known news outlets like CNN Health and New York Times. So welcome, Dr. Schlesinger. We're very grateful to have you and look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you for having me. And as we were saying earlier, it's too bad I can't be there in person. Of course, this is a great time of year to visit Wisconsin. And I also live in Wisconsin and have family there. So that is especially why I put Bucky Badger on the slide. It was not just to be cute, but I'm a Badger fan. And so I used to live in Heartland, Wisconsin. I went to high school at Heartland Arrowhead. And so I mapped my old house to UW-Madison. So you can see just over an hour away. And obviously there's some fun things I miss. My mom sends me a Kringle every year for the holidays. And I'm actually not drinking all those 3 brandy old fashions. That's when I was with my mom and my grandmother before COVID. And so when I tell people about brandy in the South, they don't know what I'm talking about. So I have to explain that to them. When my when I was in Wisconsin, we were visiting Mayo Clinic, and we had just driven across the state line into Minnesota, and my grandmother even refused to order brandy old fashioned because she felt that Minnesotans didn't make it the right way. So cute things there. And it was great to see Pascal's here. I wasn't sure if she was going to be, but I met her a long time ago now. Back in 2015, I did the short course on human factors and patient safety, and that's where I met Pascal and met Megan Lane Fall from Penn, and Mike Edmond, who was at the University of Iowa, now at West Virginia. So besides it being a wonderful experience at UW and getting to meet Pascal, formed some collaborative relationships, both working but really dear friends from that, which I think is obviously one of Pascal's hopes, and it really is borne out to be great, where we've traded visiting professorships between those other people. And Megan Lane Fall and I have actually published together in Critical Care Medicine, the premier journal of critical care medicine. So it really, I can't say enough good things about that course. And obviously, having lived in Wisconsin, I'm sure you all know, but you're at an absolutely wonderful institution. So this is Nashville. If you haven't been, come visit me. We have good stuff too. We're sitting on a river. The building that looks like the Batman building is the AT&T building. So it's really nice skyline. It's grown a lot in the past 5 years or so. We are the #1 bachelorette party destination of the entire United States. We've surpassed Las Vegas, for better or worse, but now downtown is a nightmare for. But some interesting things about Nashville you may not know. We've had really a rough past about year and a half. This was March of last year. The tornado ripped through parts of the city. So these were pictures from last March. And then if you remember, on Christmas Day, there was a bombing And so these are pictures from the bombing in downtown Nashville. And then just a couple of weeks ago, we had terrible storms and flooding. So we've had our share of woes as well, but it is a great city, and Vanderbilt's a great place too, of course. So my background is in music before medicine, and I've been playing the piano since I was 5. My undergrad degree is in jazz piano performance, studied at Loyola New Orleans, and this was before Hurricane Katrina. So I put myself through school playing the piano in the French Quarter. I also worked for Carnival Cruise Lines, and the chair of biomedical engineering, Mike King, is a guitarist, and he came to me about 5 years ago and said, "Joe, we should start a band." I said, "Well, Mike, you can start a band and I will play in the band." And he has assembled a band of all engineering faculty, which I have appointment in the School of Engineering. And we are called VIBE, the Vanderbilt Initiative of Biofunky Engineers. So we are surprisingly decent, and which is a dangerous level to be, because that means I really care about the music. And to that end, if you go to my YouTube channel, Joe Schlesinger Jazz, you can check out some clips of us. Please leave good comments. So I saw this in Montreal, surprisingly in English, but quiet hospital zone, which makes you wonder, should there be a comma like quiet hospital zone, or are they saying it's a quiet hospital zone, which would almost be more interesting, because we know there's no such thing as a quiet hospital zone. Either, being a clinician, or a lot of you do research, of course, in healthcare setting. So I'm an anesthesiologist, subspecialized in critical care medicine. So my practice is in the OR. I do everything except for cardiac anesthesia. I do mostly neuro anesthesia. And in the ICU, I do surgical ICU, neuro ICU, and burn ICU. I work at Vanderbilt and the VA as well. So here's an operating room. Can you see my mouse as well, or can I just see my mouse? You can see it too? Okay. So the anesthesiologist is here at the head of the bed. Despite what you see on TV, we are not drunk and doing Sudoku. We are vigilant and really the boss of the operating room. I can cancel surgery. A surgeon can't cancel my anesthetic. So here we are at the head of the bed, and you can see our anesthesia machine is behind us and to our right. So we have the patient monitor with the vital signs visually displayed, but if we're standing here at the head of the bed looking at what's going on with the patient, the vital signs are outside of our visual receptive field. So we have to turn our body, turn our visual attention to look at the monitor. The drug cart behind us here, we have to turn our back completely on the patient to get medicines or drugs for the patient from there. So again, totally then not paying attention to the patient. And the sound of the alarms comes from a speaker on the side of the patient monitor at the anesthesia machine. So you can see that it's the ergonomics of it are kind of strange in that we can't be attending to all things at once. And really, we have no appreciable visual input if we're at the head of the bed being vigilant. Setup in the ICU, this is an extreme example, but these things would all be in a patient's room that's sick. So obviously the patient would be on the bed. If I'm at the head of the bed, putting in a breathing tube or putting in a central line, which is a big IV that goes in the neck, the patient monitor, again with the vital signs, is directly above my head. So completely out of my visual receptive field. There's nothing I can do to see that if I'm at the head of the bed. These are all IV infusion pumps to infuse medication into the patient, dialysis machine, mechanical ventilator. So alarms that go off from the patient monitor can be silenced centrally. They can be silenced at a nursing station. But alarms that come from these other devices, you have to physically touch the device to silence it. So imagine you're a nurse, you have 2 patients, which is a common ratio, and you're busy in one patient's room. Well, if your patient in the other room is getting an infusion, say, of antibiotics, when that infusion finishes, the IV infusion pump's going to alarm. Well, if the antibiotics finish, that alarm is not a critical alarm. You don't have to run in and do anything. So if you're busy, let's say the IV antibiotics finish at 3 in the morning, you're not going to be running in to silence that, but it's going to wake up the patient. So the sleep deprivation and interruption of the circadian rhythm can precipitate ICU delirium, which can lead to long-term cognitive impairment. And so even though you get out of the ICU alive, your quality of life may not be the same if you have these neuropsychological issues and cognitive impairment following your ICU stay. Conversely, if you are giving a critical medication, such as, say, an epinephrine infusion to keep the heart rate and blood pressure stable, and that drug were to finish an alarm, if you don't have another bag of that medicine ready to go, that patient could crash and die. Well, the alarm to signify that the epinephrine is finished or the vancomycin, an antibiotic, is finished is the same alarm. So these alarms, the dialysis machine has a separate set of alarms, the mechanical ventilator. And even though those have alarms within different companies, they're different sounding alarms. So there's a standard that governs alarms, and it comes from the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. And the standard that governs these alarms is the standard 60601-1-8, which came out with a amendment this past summer, which our work has influenced, which I'll explain a little bit. But you can appreciate just the cacophony of physical space these machines take up, the human interaction where you have to actually touch the machine, but then you have the patient. And so imagine from a perception of care standpoint, if you're the patient and there's an alarm that goes off, and if it's the epinephrine or the vancomycin, again, it's the same alarm. If we're not running into the room when an alarm goes off, the patient doesn't know it's not critical. Every alarm to the patient is critical. To them, they don't know what it signifies. So how do they perceive the quality of care if we are seemingly lackadaisical to coming in and addressing it? So that's part of the issue too. So when we think of the multisensory experience, we have usually in the hospital hearing and vision, we have a lot of information, especially for sick patients. So what's the patient's blood pressure here? And someone's going to have to unmute and answer. I will call on you. So somebody has to unmute and answer.
126/50.
Okay. Does anyone have any other answers?
I was gonna guess 124/60 because it's the one at the bottom.
Okay. Anyone have any other answers? I want one more answer. Be brave. This is a warm and nurturing environment.
The only other thing that looks like a blood pressure to me is 133/60.
Great. So we have people pick 3 different answers. So the 133/60 is correct. And that's from an arterial line. So that's an invasive monitor. It's like an IV that goes in the artery, and you have beat-to-beat blood pressure monitoring. The 124/60 is from a non-invasive blood pressure cuff. If you look really closely above the 124/60, do you see where it says auto 1 hour? That means the blood pressure cuff is going off every hour. So that blood pressure could be 2 seconds old or 59 minutes old. I don't know. The 126/50 is the pulmonary artery pressure. That is extremely high. That should be about half of what it is. This patient is extremely, extremely sick. And we're not going to go into cardiopulmonary physiology. That's not the subject of the talk. But that's a very dangerous pulmonary artery pressure. But you can see how it's near systemic. So it would be a normal systemic pressure. And so if you're glancing at it, where do you look? And when you look at something, we always have the sense of denial. In medicine, never say never, never say always. So when there's something that's wrong, we love to blame the machine, or we love to see what we want to see. So look at the difference between these 2 napkins. So it kind of took a minute. Hannah smiled about 15 seconds after looking at it. So we have the sense of what we want to see, and you're like, well, these are the same, but obviously Delta did not make this mistake. That would be horrible. But we tend to also see what we want to see. So we have our own biases, or are primed to believe something, and we don't want to always blame the patient. So it leads to this sense of slowness of care. It's like when my residents stick the breathing tube in the esophagus, and they're like, no, Dr. Schlesinger, I saw it go in the trachea. I'm like, well, the abdomen is moving. I don't hear breath sounds. There's no end-tidal CO2. I'm like, no, I saw it go in the trachea. It's, they're in denial. They don't want to be wrong. They don't want me to take over. I get that. But these are people's lives. So it's a big deal. So let's talk a little bit about music. And when we talk about music research, people think sometimes literal music, but what music research refers to is also our soundscape and alarmscape in our multisensory environment. So has anyone had surgery before? Presumably, okay, great. So I saw Hannah's hand. I only see a few people's pictures, so I might pick on you a lot, Hannah, if that's okay. Can you tell us, what do you envision the operating room environment is like, from, people talking, what sounds are present, what's going on?
I mean, the thing that I think of first about the times I've had surgery is it's like really cold. There's a lot of people and they're all talking.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like you're there as a patient, like you're there, but also they're not focused on you. Like they're focused on you, but they're not. They're doing all these other things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, my slide has music notes on it. What do you think about music in the OR? Do you think we listen to music the majority of the time, the minority of the time? Who picks the music? Why does that person pick the music? Who chooses the volume of the music?
Well, then I'd have to go to my Grey's Anatomy knowledge and
Sure.
say that it probably comes on after the patient is under, and then the surgeon gets to decide like what are we listening to and like what they're feeling so that they can do the best surgery. And they probably have the say over it. And maybe it's like really loud, but then I imagine then like when I drive a car, and I slow down, need to know where I'm going, I probably turn the volume down so I can like focus. So that's what I'm imagining.
So the surgeon does often pick the music, which is baffling to me. As I said earlier, the anesthesiologist is the boss of the OR, in the sense that, you're not going to do surgery without anesthesia, right? But from a personality standpoint, surgeons tend to have more aggressive personalities than we do. So they are the self-proclaimed boss of the OR. They do often pick the music, which has been a transition from, before my practice day of having like a boombox on top of the anesthesia machine. When I was a resident, we still had the centralized speakers in the OR and Pandora and Spotify and things like that. So the surgeon is telling the circulating nurse, hey, put on, in Nashville, 2000s country hits or whatever, and it's loud. And, Hannah mentioned the changing of the volume, but who's going to change that volume? It's still going to be the circulator, the circulating nurse, because the surgeon is scrubbed in doing surgery. He or she is not going to change the volume. So the nurse doesn't know when we're at a kind of mission critical point of the surgery. So I was doing the anesthetic for a Whipple surgery, which is a huge, huge surgery for pancreatic cancer, huge incision, massive, long surgery. And the surgeon nicked the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is the big blood vessel that brings blood from the lower body back to the heart. When the surgeon cuts a hole in a major blood vessel, do you think the surgeon says, hey, Joe, I just nicked the inferior vena cava? Nope. They just want to secretly fix the problem. Well, it's hard to secretly fix a gaping hole in a major blood vessel without me finding out, because the patient's blood pressure dropped from normal to 50/30. Their heart rate skyrocketed from a compensatory standpoint. Alarms were going off. So I was busy trying to keep the patient alive. The surgeon was trying to fix the vessel, and I thought the patient was going to code and potentially die. So I said to the circulator, turn the music down and get the crash cart. Well, so I gave her two commands. So naturally, she triaged them and ran outside of the OR to find the crash cart, leaving the music blaring. So now it's a stressful situation, and the surgeon and I are having to yell at each other, not because we're mad at each other, but just to communicate. And so this is a huge problem. Why do the surgeons pick the music? I need to hear the alarms. I need to hear the pulse ox. To me, the surgeon dictating the acoustic environment is like me looking over the drapes and saying, hey, I think today you should use 5-0-Proline to close the incision. I mean, that's insanity. And it's been a problem. So this is from the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation closed claims database. And there was a patient who had a bad outcome because an alarm was missed because the music was too loud. But the interesting thing to note here is the lesson, the last sentence, the lesson learned stated by the submitter was that music should not be played in the operating room. Well, what do you think about that? Do you think that's true? So one bad thing happened, this N of 1. John Lee and I were talking about automation in vehicles and saying, okay, so someone dies. But does that mean the research should stop, or you should totally change the practice paradigm? Like, death is bad, no doubt, but now should music not be played? Because Hannah said, well, music, it's a pleasurable construct. A happy surgeon is a happy anesthesiologist. There's been literature that shows that there's better surgical efficiency having music versus not having music. More surgical efficiency is more throughput, it's more money for the hospital. All good things. So do we swing to the opposite extreme and pendulum and then not have music? Well, that doesn't sound to be a good idea either. But how do we control the volume of music when we need to communicate and perceive our alarms? So me and this anesthesiologist in Montana developed this device called a canary box. And what it does is when there is a yellow or warning alarm, it halves the volume of the music. And when there's a red or crisis alarm, it turns the music off. So when you think of alerting mechanisms, the classical thought is you need to add something to the acoustic environment to be alerting. But you don't. You need to modulate the acoustic environment. So if you change the volume of the music by making it softer, that's still alerting. Not only is that alerting, but it's also going to improve speech intelligibility and communication, but also alarm perception. So here's a video that shows how this functions.
I'm starting to fade. Can we hear some music?
Sure, after this it's the weekend.
Turn off that music.
Someone call a code blue.
What happened?
Wake up, sir.
Take a deep breath. Everything is all right.
So I promise you I'm a better anesthesiologist than cartoon creator, but you get the point. And so what we're doing now is we did a study to look at basically the end user of this and a qualifiable aspect of it being in the OR, usability, that type of thing, and had great data. So now we wanted a more robust, quantifiable approach. And so we have it in the children's ORs, in the orthopedic trauma ORs, where music is the loudest. And we're looking at response time and accuracy to alarm events in the presence and absence of music volume modulation. So stay tuned for those data. So far, I did an interim analysis. It's looking very promising, but it's the surgeons really don't mind. And we've have the volume quickly fade in and out. So if there is a very critical surgical step going on, it's not going to be a jarring volume change of the music. So what I wanted to look at too, well, is music good or bad? And as a musician, we talked about the pleasurable construct of it, et cetera, but does it hurt speech intelligibility having music? And so my early work, which we may have time to get to in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, found that alarms can be softer than background noise. And we're going to talk more about that. But I took that same paradigm and I added music to some of the trial blocks to say, well, how does this affect speech intelligibility? So we use the same paradigm as my JASA paper, and the speech intelligibility task is called a CRM. And so what that is there's 3 talkers, a target, and 2 maskers, and it looks at speech intelligibility of focusing your auditory attention on the target. And the music I added, notably, there's 2 big things to remember here. I added volume normalized music. So in the original tasks, we had OR background noise. The music I added was volume normalized. So I'm not adding music louder than what had existed in the other non-music trials. So it's not a volume problem. And the music was non-lyrical. There was no singing, there were no words. So it's not going to be a speech masking problem. but the music was subjectively attention diverting. It was something that you would kind of listen to and like. And specifically, if you've heard of the band, or if you haven't, checked them out, called Snarky Puppy, which is a great band name, but it's kind of funky, cool music. And so it's music that you would kind of, rock, tap your foot to. And I wanted that on purpose. So it's not a volume problem. It's not a speech masking problem. It makes you feel good listening to the music subjectively to most of the participants. So you can see here, though, in the presence of music, looking at the proportion correct of the speech task, they did worse. So again, not speech masking, not volume, but just adding music to the environment. You feel better, but you do worse on the speech intelligibility task. Not only do you do worse, but you're slower. And you could say, okay, well, the difference of, sub-second performance times, is that life or death? And that's where people really have this misunderstanding. And that's where I get this issue from reviewers a lot, because they're like, okay, well, yeah, they're slower by less than a second. Does that mean everyone's dying in the OR? No, but this is not, I'm not making a claim to life and death of patients, but think now in terms of auditory response time from a neuroscience standpoint, where 300 milliseconds as far as a response time in the auditory neuroscience domain is huge. That's gigantic. So, but we could argue about the semantics of that. Here's the more important thing, is the proportion of no response. So this means that by adding volume normalized music without words, there was a statistically significant effect where with music, people didn't, it wasn't a right or wrong, it was that they literally did not recognize people were talking. Because we told them, the participants, respond every time, whether you're sure or not sure, just do your best. When you hear this, when you hear the talkers, do your best, make your best guess. So proportion of no response really would refer to they weren't aware that humans were talking. And that's terrifying, because in medicine, we would like to think we're good with closed loop communication. We're terrible. We're absolutely terrible. The best example is aviation. And if you listen to, you can go and Google the air traffic control recordings, and it's fascinating to hear a pilot communicate with air traffic control and the closed loop communication. We're horrible about it because we make assumptions on, if I say, Hannah, give 1 milligram of epinephrine, and you see me, I'm watching the situation, it's so rare where then Hannah's going to be like, I gave 1 milligram of epinephrine. I mean, that just doesn't happen. The best way that we simulated what to do is when I was a critical care fellow, we were in the sim lab, and I was the team leader of a code, and I was blindfolded. So I had to lead a code blindfolded. I had zero visual input, but because everyone else knew I couldn't see anything, there was only one person would speak at a time. And they knew if I said, Hannah, give 1 milligram of epinephrine, unless you said 1 milligram of epinephrine has been given, or I gave 1 milligram of epinephrine, I would have no idea you did it. It was quiet. The timbre and prosody of everyone's voice was calmer, and the closed loop communication was beautiful. But could you imagine me in real life showing up to the ICU and then putting on a blindfold? If the patient would die, I would have a longer trial than Chauvin has. So bad news bears. But it's really fascinating to think about how we communicate. So I'm going to play an alarm that we have, and it's not just we, this is from the Philips patient monitor. A lot of hospital systems have an alarm that this is the alarm, or it's very, very similar to this. And I want you to think, and I want 4 people to answer this time, and I want you to tell me when you hear the alarm, is the problem high heart rate, low heart rate, high blood pressure, low blood pressure, or low oxygen level? Okay? So think of what's wrong with the patient. Here's the alarm. I think you get the idea. Stop it halfway. That's what I get to hear at work. Great, isn't it? So what's wrong with the patient? So unmute. I want 4 people to answer. Not at the same time. All right, Rachel.
I would say low oxygen.
Oh, oxygen. All right, Hannah.
Anna or Hannah? I have no idea. No answer.
Well, you have to guess.
I have to guess? Okay, I'll go with oxygen then too.
'Cause I can't hear an alarm and be like, well, I don't know. All right, Pascal, what do you think? Calling on the boss.
There you go. I agree with Hannah and Rachel.
Everyone's going with low oxygen? All right. Who thinks it's something besides that? Gabriel, what do you think?
I don't know. Yeah, I agree with Rachel first here. But,
Okay.
sorry.
So
You're getting consistency, Joe.
yeah, well, so I guess I could say you are all right and you are all wrong, because that if your oxygen level is low, you would have that alarm, but you'd have that alarm too if your blood pressure is high or your blood pressure is low, your heart rate's high or heart rate's low. That alarm is the same alarm for all of those. So it tells me nothing. To also show you the lunacy of this design, if I'm in the OR and we don't like to say put you to sleep for surgery because people think of their pets. Like, we obviously wake you up at the end. So we say induce anesthesia. So when I induce anesthesia, the goal in a general anesthetic is you stop breathing. You stop breathing and we put in the breathing tube. If I can't ventilate and oxygenate you, you're going to die. So a little bit of stress there. But when I induce anesthesia and you stop breathing, the apnea alarm, the not breathing alarm, is also that alarm. So that alarm goes off, and it's going off because you're not breathing. Well, I know you're not breathing. That was my goal. And so that alarm is blaring in my ear while I'm focusing on your airway. One of the most important parts of my job, to get a breathing tube in your trachea to keep you alive, that's blaring in my ear. So my visual attention is 100% focused on your airway. If your blood pressure were to drop to say 40/20, which is like you're going to code and die, like you are near death, there is no new auditory information to tell me that, because the not breathing alarm's already going off. Because that alarm's already going off, your blood pressure drops thereafter, no new auditory information. Yes, it's on the patient monitor, but my visual attention is totally focused on your airway. How is this design what we have? This is the best we have. This
Okay.
is, yeah, no, please.
Just quick. So I guess you're alluding to like just differentiating say you target. So there's an alarm goes on. Let's say it's respiratory. So you go and you treat that and you maybe stabilize respiratory, but then something else goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's
yeah. So as it says, you're not breathing, and I'm working on getting the breathing tube in. My visual attention is focused on your airway. Your blood pressure drops. There's no new auditory information that tells me, and my visual attention cannot be diverted because I'm focusing on your airway. This is the design. This is the best we have. So when I think that this is the best we have, right? That's the best we have. It makes me think of the state of Oklahoma. And here's why. I was born in Oklahoma, so I can say this confidently. And you think of, okay, that alarm is the best we have. Well, the reason why it makes me think of the state of Oklahoma is this was my parents' license plate. Oklahoma is okay. So I would like to say a bunch of smart people sat around and dreamt that up, but since we're talking about Oklahoma, I don't want to make too much of a reach. But it also makes you think about, what was the second place slogan? Oklahoma is okay. So that red alarm, that's the best we have. Like, what in the world? So we need to do a better job. Why do patients need to hear alarms? We talked at the beginning that, you're a patient, you hear this loud, abrasive, shrill, uninformative alarm. It's false the vast majority of the time. So the positive predictive value of alarms are horrible. And it's because they're designed by engineers who want to ensure that the alarms are never missed from a perception standpoint, and they're never not going to go off when there's an emergency. So from a design standpoint, the companies and the engineers want to make them so they're not going to end up in a courtroom, right? And so if the alarm positive predictive value is horrible, again, from a perception of care, the patient's perceived care is maybe lackluster. But why does the patient have to hear the alarm? We need to know what's going on. But why does that alarm have to blare next to the patient's head at 3 a.m, wake them up, ICU delirium, sleep deprivation, long-term cognitive impairment? So we developed a device just as a prototype to say, well, can we take that horrible red alarm and dissect it out of the experience for the patient? So instead of changing the monitor itself, which you could say, well, just don't have the monitor alarm. Okay, well, that's easier said than done because you're changing a hospital system, and you can do that in a lab setting, but you can't just do whatever you want in the hospital, as you know. So we said, well, what if we had a device that could just dissect it out of that sensory environment? So we created this, and I mentor senior undergraduate BME students in design. So we do different things every year. And so we did this one year. And my goal for it is to not only do something, but how inexpensive can we do it? So obviously, it's not a beautiful looking thing, but it's functional. So you can see here, the alarm frequencies of that red alarm has the fundamental at 960 hertz, and it has this horrible harmonic at 2,880 hertz. Speech frequencies lie just to the left of that. So if we're going to dissect out this red alarm, what I don't want to have happen is make speech sound artificial and robotic, because now we're flirting with speech frequencies. So I don't want to trade one problem for another, because then if I make the environment sound not genuine and real, then could that be deliriogenic, right, and cause delirium? So people say, well, what about earplugs and eye shades? Okay, great. That's fine when you want to fly, a transatlantic overnight flight. Putting earplugs in a patient for a multi-day, multi-night ICU stay is not a tenable solution, because I don't know about you, I don't sleep well with eye shades and earplugs, but even if I did, it's changing my natural environment, and that could be deliriogenic as well. So we said, okay, you can see from the left panel to the right panel, we were successfully able to dissect out those red alarm spectra. So I can say from a spectral standpoint, we did it. But what matters is the experience standpoint. So we went a step further, and we did what's called a consonant nucleus consonant test, which is a paradigm in hearing and speech, which this looks at single syllable words, looking at the full word and the phoneme. So the phoneme is the sound of the word. So like in goose, it's the g sound, the oo sound, and the s sound. So you have the three phonemes in the one syllable word. And we looked at the score of the CNC test in the presence and absence of alarm filtering. And what we found is that both the word score and the phoneme score improved when we filtered the alarm. My goal was to not worsen speech comprehension. I just didn't want it to get worse. It got better. So you would say, well, yeah, if you take the alarm out, it should get better. But remember, we're flirting with those speech frequencies. It got better. Not only did it get better, but subjectively, the participants felt less stressed hearing the red alarm, naturally. So this was featured on CNN Health. So that's where we got that feature. Sadly, we were not successful getting this patented because, as it turns out, Bose, the headphone company, is very, very good with their patent writing. And even though they don't work in healthcare and our technology was different than theirs, the patent reviewer felt like Bose had covered that space. So that's a bummer, but CNN's pretty cool too. So as Hannah said, it's actually one of the things I'm most proud of. And I think it's a little thing to talk about for the students, and we can talk about more, in the next hour, but we're all under the pressure as faculty as well, and promotion tracks. They're like, well, how many publications do you have? How many grants do you have? What's the impact factor? And I think we think of what an impact factor of a journal is. What is impact and what is impactful? So in academia, I could be like, hey, I published with Megan Lane Fall in Critical Care Medicine. It's the top journal in our field. It has impact factor over 7, which is big for, specialty medical journals. And I really give a lot of street cred to Pascal on that. I wouldn't have met Megan otherwise. That said, 99% Invisible is listened to a lot more people than read critical care medicine journals. So I think the popular press is also important to get the word out, especially when we think about patient safety and what we do in healthcare. So I want to talk about sound and music research, as we talked about sonification and how we think of sound and how we can communicate data from sound. So I want to play this clip of my favorite jazz pianist, Herbie Hancock, and he's doing what's called trading fours with Derek Trucks on guitar. And I want you to think about, it's like a couple minute clip, and I want to play the whole thing because I want you to see over time, how does Herbie Hancock and Derek Trucks change what they're doing? Are they communicating through sound? So are they, when they're going back and forth every 4 measures, think about, are they just kind of improvising and do what they want to do? Do they change what they play based on the other person? And how so? And I want you to try to describe it, because I'm going to call on you again to describe it in the best musical terms you can. You don't have to say, well, hey, they did an altered dominant, motif, but you can talk about, where they are on the piano, the highness, the lowness. So I want you to think about, how does it change, and do they communicate through sound? All right. It's pretty great music, isn't it? So what do y'all think? How do they communicate musically? If they do, how so? And how did what they did change over time?
I'll give my jump to. So at the very, I'll start with the beginning. There was obviously improvising, and then they pick up a little bit of the riffs of one another to sort of respond, I guess, to respond to.
Yeah. But I mean, I think I kind of told you that. But from like melody, harmony, the range, rhythm, like try to use a little more musical words as best as you can.
Oh boy.
Adam, how about you? I'm scanning, I'm looking who else here. Adam Schmidt.
Yeah, I do not know music very well.
That's okay. That's the point. We're not music theory class. So just describe as best as you can, how did it change over time?
The one thing I picked up was the tempo very increased towards the end.
Okay.
In the beginning.
Okay. Jane, how about you? Maybe she's not there. Demetrius.
I guess the art phase of the music changed a little bit as they were trying to communicate with each other, saying, okay, I need you to do this now that I'm playing the key. Something like that. That's how you're communicating.
Okay, it's a little hard for me to hear you. How about Priya?
I guess the rhythms were kind of similar, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, they were definitely like, you saw that they were kind of mocking each other in a way, but they were using a constrained range, and then both Herbie Hancock and Derek Trucks were using a more melodic, the breadth of the melody, the harmonic complexity, the rhythm, the intensity. So is it fair to say you can communicate data via sound, or you can communicate via sound? Is that a fair assertion? I guess you can nod or shake your head. I'll just scan around and look at your videos. Yeah, all right. I see Catherine nodding. Great. So you can, and that's what sonification is. So why, again, the alarms don't tell us anything. What we wanted to do with one of the teams was to say, well, can we communicate data through sound and be more informative? And the tough thing with sonification, so if you look at any work from ICAD, the International Conference of Auditory Display, and there's other groups that do this too, you can communicate data through sound, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. And just because you can, then how much data do you communicate through sound? And is it something people want to hear? So I could take complex physiology, communicate through sound, and in a lab say, okay, do this 20-minute experiment. Great, you performed well, you could understand the communication of data and sound. But is that something, say, as an ICU nurse who works a 12-hour shift, you want to listen to for 12 hours? So we created, we took the physiologic variables that can kill you now, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygenation, and we had a soundscape, a musical soundscape, an aesthetically pleasing soundscape to communicate that. So we didn't want to make it so jarring and so abnormal that it turns into alarm in and of itself. And then we also looked at adding a haptic or vibrotactile stimulus. So going in, I thought this is going to be a chip shot because we're going to have great sonification and people are going to love listening to it because it's musical, and we're going to have haptics, which is a sensory stream that we don't really use. And so our data is going to be so amazing, and we're going to change the entire practice of medicine. But we can't just do things isolated in a lab. So we had a distracting task to increase the cognitive demand, and we used the stop signal reaction task. And this looks at response inhibition. So to explain it better, basically the participant's looking at a white fixation dot, and they will have a white arrow be left or right, and you respond left or right on the keypad. If it's a blue arrow, you don't respond, but the white arrow can turn to blue. And if that happens, you need to withhold your response. That's response inhibition. So there's a more level of executive function and control to do that. So we added that for cognitive demand. And here's what we found. We did not change the practice of medicine. It was statistically not significant that they didn't perform a lot better. But you also think of design and then implementation. Remember, we were designing sonification to have aesthetic components. And also from implementation, there's a lot in the haptics literature that look at haptic vests and putting on all these actuators. So we could have made the super exotic, over head-mounted display and over-the-ear headphones and all these haptic actuators, and in the lab setting, hit it out of the park. But that is not a tenable solution in the hospital. So we used an ankle actuator because you have to be bare below the elbows in a sterile setting in the hospital. So we can't have anything on the wrist. So we can't have like an Apple Watch type of setup. We did a separate pilot study to make sure that the ankle was fine from an anatomical site. You can't just, again, say, oh, I'll just use a different site, whatever. And we showed non-inferiority to using the ankle. So we used it there. And then we used bone conduction headphones because we didn't want something occluding the ear and perception that way, but we also wanted to be discreet. You're not going to walk in a patient room with a huge head-mounted display. That's going to be unnerving to them too. So I'm very sensitive to the implementation and the end user and the practicality of doing things instead of just the super elaborate design, which is ultimately going to go nowhere. So it was kind of a bummer though. I was hoping we'd have great data. And I think this, and I'm purposely showing this because I have a lot of papers and data, and I'm showing you data that didn't work out. And my hypothesis was not what was not proven. But what it showed is that there was, people didn't have a statistically significant benefit, but there was a trend towards increased perception of change with the haptic stimulus. But importantly, the participants felt more confident in their response. So you could say, okay, we're getting into the neuroscience and looking at milliseconds of response and accuracy and statistics, and all that's important, of course. But if you show that there's non-inferiority and there's a trend towards improvement and there's a preference for the multisensory alarm, that's great. You know, that's a step in the right direction still, in my opinion. And especially with haptics, the nice thing there is a very personal input. So you have this haptic input that no one else really knows you have, which is really important. So instead of getting into a whole new set of study, which we're going to run out of time for, I want to end here to say that it's not just about medicine, as I'm sure you all know. Is we think about high consequence industry, you know, aviation, transportation, automation in vehicles, construction, nuclear power, et cetera. And that idea of the psychology and the neuroscience and the human factors approach is really important. And that's what's great about, you know, HFES and IEA, but there's all these tracks. And so I find myself going a lot to the aviation stuff at HFES because, I mean, the medicine stuff, I see those people all the time. And it's really a hallmark of safety, but it's a slippery slope to say, oh, well, it just applies widely as well. Because you think of, let's take aviation and even self-driving cars. Those are kind of a sterile cockpit. You know, you're in that self-driving car, that Tesla is going to be the same as every other Tesla that's made. If you fly for Delta or Southwest, if you're in a Boeing 737, you can fly pretty much any Boeing 737. Even the ORs at Vanderbilt are different from each other in one part of the hospital or another. Same with the ICU. And then you look at speech alarms, which is more common in aviation and we don't use in medicine. So it's important to work together and have these multidisciplinary groups, which you all have. And I was asking Gabriel about the makeup of your department, and it's really great that you have this. And you know, Pascal, even if she were not attending, you know, is a world leader in this area. So I really encourage you to continue to do this and think creatively on the sensory experience, but also the application. So not just thinking, oh, we can create this exotic lab design that's not going to be adapted, but we also have these standards. So you also can't just do whatever you want. And so it's very difficult to really design a really great study that answers a specific question. And your group and our group is one of the few that I think really are attentive to those downstream end user effects. But you know, I have a lot more things to share, which we'll share kind of the student discussion. And then I really do hope that the discussion doesn't end here. So you all have my email. And even though it's easier to do this at conferences and hang out and figure out collaboration, I do implore you to please keep in touch and visit me in Nashville. So thank you for your time. And let's use the last little bit of time now before the student time to address any questions that I can answer for you.
So Joe, I'm wondering if I could ask you to comment on, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but there are two things that I find fascinating in the work that you and your colleagues have done, and your colleagues around the world have done. And I think that I think is a unique characteristic of what you've done, is really bring together people from around the world. But the relationship to industry and design of equipment and devices, and the relationship to standards and standard organizations. So maybe you can address the latter one, and maybe you could talk to the students about relationship to industry.
Yeah, so from a standard standpoint, you know, there's no standards police. And we say standard, and it's really more of a guideline because, you know, again, there's no hospitals getting fined. There's no standards police. There's no IEC force. And so versus like a standard, when we think about a standard in medicine, like pulse oximetry, I cannot do an anesthetic without pulse oximetry. That would be malpractice. But I think a lot of industry is going to be mindful of the IEC standard in the sense of it's really best practice. And I think the amendment that came out this past summer is more informed by evidence than it ever has been. The industry side is difficult though, because good science is slow, and especially with sound. So if you're going to create a device, you're going to sell it from a visual standpoint. It looks sexy on your website or when you're presenting it at a conference. The visual display and user interface is what captures people's attention and pulls you over there. But it's a multi-sensory thing. So think of the patient monitor. They're expensive, say $20,000. Why do they put a $3 Radio Shack speaker on this expensive device? Why is the sound uninformative? Why does it have a flat amplitude envelope? It's so terrible from a design standpoint, but it's almost like they don't care. What's the impetus for them to do it? They create loud abrasive alarms because they don't want you to miss it. So if no one's dropping dead because of their product, what gives them the push to change? And the approach with industry is typically, let's create a lot of things, let's get it out in the market, then we'll do a bunch of retrospective analyses and see what sticks statistically. They're not doing typically not doing well-designed prospective studies. And you think of sound's a complex signal, especially compared to, say, haptics, where you have amplitude, pitch, decay, attack, frequency, amplitude envelope, sharpness, roughness, and you have to dissect those out one at a time. So it's difficult where no one's holding industry's feet to the fire. Their science is usually poor. That's a blanket statement, so I said usually, not always. But I think it's tough, and you mentioned the student perspective, in a time-limited didactic setting where you have to do research, try to get it published, and then I think my comment on impact versus impactful, to get things outside of just the academic realm and then show a difference. So when we were doing all the studies with the signal to noise ratio, I'm not saying it's going to save people's lives. I would have to do a 10-year study in thousands of patients. But if it helps clinician perception, and we use this term alarm fatigue, well, what is that? We have an idea of what it is colloquially, but there's no operational definition of alarm fatigue. So it feels like the definition of insanity where we just keep doing these things, but slowly but surely, as we dissect out the neuroscience component, the psychology component, the human factors component, and think of the multisensory experience and how those all come together. I don't know if I'm totally answering your question how you asked it, but I think it's really difficult. I don't have an easy answer to say, well, this is what we should do to make industry listen, or this is the best practice to have them change their philosophy of science and business. But I think we have to just keep plugging and looking at the patient side, the clinician side, but how we bring people to the table, whether different institutions or not, but the skill sets of how we perceive this environment in a cognitively demanding environment and how we think of implementation. So I don't know, Pascal, you can tell me if I answered your question or I didn't, or there's other questions that came from that.
No, I think your answer was fascinating, Joe, because I think what you were telling us is that the sound and the alarm is really part of a hugely complex system. And I think the research that you've done is starting to really understand that and the relationship between sound and sound produced by devices in the context of a larger system, because you don't do just experimental research in the lab. You're trying to figure out how to make the sound fit in the larger system. So I think it's really interesting for our students to hear that that big lesson learned, and also thinking about the implications of your research for big things, whether it's industry or whether it's standards organization. I think it's useful for them. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions with our last couple minutes? And again, feel free to email me if you think of a question later on.
Hello, this is John. Really enjoyed the presentation. And I've got a quick question about haptics versus audio. And if you could expand on a little bit regarding the private information channel that is haptics versus the more public information channel that audio tends to be in the context of teamwork in a surgery setting, for example.
Yeah, so a few things. First, the benefit of the multisensory aspect. So because we say, well, we have visual, but as you saw, the visual is often outside of our receptive field, and head-mounted displays are not really going to work. So let's take visual out of it. And so basically we're saying now unisensory auditory versus multisensory auditory and haptics. So there's a concept in neuroscience called inverse effectiveness, or colloquially the cocktail party effect. So imagine we got to go out last night and we're at, a really loud bar and we're standing around, and I don't project well. So you're standing as, pretty close to me, let's say socially distanced, let's pretend COVID didn't exist. And, you're leaning in the whole thing, but you're still struggling to perceive what I'm saying. Without realizing it, you would look at my lips, and not because you're a lip reader, but you have the weak auditory stimulus of my voice and the weak visual stimulus of my lips, and you bind them together, and there's an enhancement or synergistic perception where you get that multisensory gain or facilitation. And so there's a lot of great work in that, and so that's why it's called the cocktail party effect. So that's the thought with haptics as well, is can you have a lower auditory stimulus or softer auditory stimulus paired with a haptic stimulus and have improved perception? So not saying to take auditory away. I don't think auditory should go away. I think multisensory is what we need, but also multisensory should be truly multisensory. They should work together, which is not to say it's not multiple unisensory streams. Now, the other thing with the teamwork and perception, because you could say, okay, well, if you have a private information channel, are you taking away the safety benefit of having other people perceive it? Or if it's a novel sensory information and you're not used to it, is that safe? And so what we've done is looked at what I call the pre-alarm space. So let's take heart rate as an example. For an adult, less than 60, over 100 are the thresholds for an alarm. So between 60 and 100, there's no auditory information. But I want to know if my fresh out of the OR cardiac surgery patient, if their heart rate's in the 60s and it's trending up and it's going to eclipse 100, I kind of want to know when it's heading that way. So the haptic information we built in and the sonification information we built in has been in that pre-alarm space. So if we have, it's a glass half full, half empty kind of thing, if we get 50% accuracy, you could say, well, that's a terrible design. 50% of the time they were wrong. Or you could say, well, 50% of the time they were right before an alarm sounded, and there's 50% fewer auditory threshold alarms. So you're naturally exposing people to fewer auditory horrible, alarms in that alarm state. You're providing proactive care instead of reactive care because you're sensing the trend from normal to abnormal, but you still have the redundant safety system of those threshold alarms. And that's where I feel the implementation. I'm not saying wholesale, like, let's start ripping the Philips monitor off the walls. I mean, maybe eventually, but I want my work now to basically be not needed as we continue to do work. So like the patient, the filtering device, people say, well, improve the alarms, then you won't need your device. I said, I'm excited for when that device isn't needed. That's the goal. But until then, why do people have to suffer?
Yeah.
So I think
Thank you.
Does that answer?
Yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joe, and enjoy the conversation with grad students. I think they're gonna have fun picking up your brain and
Great.
following up on some questions. So good to see you again.
Good to see you as always, Pascal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Get a chance.